A commercial satellite crossed over the Strait of Hormuz on an ordinary morning, and within minutes the image it beamed down stopped a room full of analysts cold. This wasn't one boat drifting near a coastline. It wasn't a small patrol group on a routine run. It was roughly 130 Iranian fast attack boats, arranged in two tight formations, sitting out in the open, in broad daylight, in one of the most surveilled, most contested stretches of water on the entire planet. No missiles fired, no warning shots. Just boats, visible to anyone with a basic commercial satellite subscription, gathering in a channel that carries roughly a fifth of the entire world's oil supply. Within the hour, that image was on desks at U.S. Central Command headquarters in Tampa, Florida. And the question in that building wasn't, what is Iran doing? Everyone already understood what Iran was doing. The real question was why now, and how far this was about to go. Because by the time those boats showed up on satellite, the United States already had 3 complete aircraft carrier strike groups sitting in the region at the same time. 3. That kind of simultaneous presence hadn't happened since the buildup to the 2003 invasion of Iraq. So before I tell you what the American military sent back in response to those boats, you need to understand one thing clearly. This was not an overreaction to a surprise. This was the visible surface of a war that had already been grinding on for months, and this was simply the moment the rest of the world couldn't look away from it anymore. Let's start with what these boats actually are, because the raw number means nothing without context. Most of them are small, fiberglass hulls. Aluminum hulls, a scattering of larger patrol craft mixed in with what are essentially armed skiffs bolted together with rocket pods and machine guns. On their own, not one of these boats could put a scratch on a modern American destroyer. A single Iranian speedboat facing off against a guided missile warship isn't a fight. It's barely a footnote, but Iran was never trying to build a fleet that could win a one-on-one engagement. Analysts gave this fleet a nickname years ago, the Mosquito fleet, and the doctrine behind that name is exactly what it sounds like. You don't take down a target with a single mosquito. You do it, or at least you make life unbearable by sending hundreds of them at once from every direction, faster than a radar operator can track, faster than a ship captain can decide which contact is a genuine threat and which one is a decoy meant to burn through his attention and his ammunition. This is asymmetric warfare, built specifically because Tehran knows it can never win a conventional naval war against an American carrier strike group. So instead of chasing firepower it will never match, Iran built speed, numbers, and unpredictability instead. And none of this is new behavior. If you think this is the first time Iranian boats have crept uncomfortably close to American ships, you need the backstory, because the pattern is the whole point. Go back to May of 2021. A Pentagon spokesman told reporters that 13 boats belonging to Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps approached 7 U.S. Navy vessels at high speed, closing to within about 140 meters before an American ship fired warning shots just to force them back. Iran denied provoking anything and claimed the opposite happened. That back and forth, 2 governments describing the same 10 minutes in 2 completely different ways, is a pattern you're going to see over and over again in this story. Fast forward to June of 2022. The U.S. Navy released footage of Iranian Revolutionary Guard boats closing to within 50 yards of an American patrol ship and a transport vessel. The standoff dragged on for nearly an hour before the American crew fired a warning flare and leaned on the horn to force the boats away. The Navy's official language at the time called the encounter unsafe and unprofessional. Hold on to that phrase, because you're going to hear it echoed again years later in a much bigger fight. 2 months after that, in August of 2023, Iranian state media aired footage showing IRGC speedboats forcing an American helicopter carrier to actually ground its aircraft mid-operation in the strait. An Iranian admiral bragged about it openly in front of a room of commanders, claiming his forces had compelled American helicopters to land shortly after takeoff. That same year, in April, an unmanned U.S. Navy drone boat made its way through the strait, while Iranian vessels shadowed it the entire distance. No shots were fired. No incident was officially logged. But the message was obvious. We are watching everything you put into this water. So by the time 2026 rolled around, nobody inside the Pentagon looked at a fresh satellite photo of Iranian boats and thought, that's strange. They had watched this exact playbook run at smaller scale for years. What changed in 2026 wasn't the tactic. It was the scale. And it was the fact that both sides had stopped firing warning shots and started firing live weapons. There's a psychological layer buried in all of this that almost never gets talked about, and it's worth slowing down for. Every one of those close encounters in 2021, 2022, and 2023 wasn't really about winning a fight in the traditional sense. It was about forcing an American commander to make a split-second decision with incomplete information. Do you fire on a boat that might just be shadowing you out of habit? Or do you hold your fire and risk letting an actual threat close the distance? Now multiply that decision by dozens of boats converging from different bearings at once, some of them decoys, some of them not, and you start to understand why the Mosquito Fleet doctrine keeps Pentagon planners up at night. It was never really about naval firepower. It's about overwhelming human judgment under pressure, and that's a problem you can't solve just by building a bigger ship. Here's why any of this matters beyond a regional squabble between two militaries with a grudge. At its narrowest point, the Strait of Hormuz is about 21 nautical miles wide. Shipping traffic squeezes into two lanes, roughly a mile across each, separated by a 2-mile buffer in the middle. Through that narrow gap moves close to a quarter of the entire world's seaborne oil trade, along with a comparable share of the planet's liquefied natural gas. When more than 100 armed boats start massing inside a choke point that tight, it doesn't matter who you are. Oil traders in Singapore notice, shipping insurers in London notice, naval planners in Washington notice. Everyone is paying attention within minutes, not days. But that buildup of 130 boats didn't materialize out of nowhere. If this is the first thing you've seen about this story, you're walking into the middle of a war that had already been running for 5 months, and none of it makes sense without rewinding to where it actually started. Go back to the final Saturday of February 2026. That date is the one most sources mark as the true starting point of what's now called the 2026 Iran War. The United States and Israel launched coordinated airstrikes against Iranian military targets, and among those killed in that opening wave was Iran's supreme leader himself. Multiple wire services confirmed the death within hours. This is not a minor footnote buried at the bottom of a news story. The killing of a sitting supreme leader of the Islamic Republic is, by almost any historical measure, one of the most consequential single events in that country's modern era. And it set the tone for absolutely everything that followed. Because here's the thing about killing a supreme leader. You don't just remove one man. You trigger a succession crisis inside a political system that is entirely built around that single office. Iran's Assembly of Experts, an 88-member clerical body whose only real function is choosing the next supreme leader, moved fast. Within about a week, they had named the late leader's 56-year-old son as his successor. Iran's political leadership, its armed forces, and the Revolutionary Guard all pledged loyalty to him almost immediately. Analysts who study Iran closely read that choice as a deliberate message. A researcher at a Beirut-based university told international media that the selection signaled continuity, not reform, and described it as an act of open defiance aimed directly at Washington and Jerusalem. The subtext was simple. If the US and Israel believed killing one man would collapse the system was going to respond by installing someone just as hardline, if not more so. President Trump, in an interview around that same period, said something that made the succession crisis even stranger. He told American media that the strike which killed the supreme leader had actually been so effective that it wiped out most of the likely successors his own administration had been tracking. His framing was blunt. Whoever Iran ended up choosing wasn't going to be anyone Washington had anticipated, because in his words, they were all dead. So you had a hardline installation happening within days, stacked on top of a decapitation strike that had accidentally erased the moderate alternatives from the pool entirely. That combination is the political backdrop for everything Iran did militarily for the rest of the year, including those boats. Iran's first major response wasn't military, it was economic pressure, applied through the strait itself. Tehran effectively closed Hormuz to shipping. Iranian state television and officials broadcast open warnings over maritime radio, telling every vessel in the region that nothing was getting through. Now, under international maritime law, Iran technically doesn't have the authority to unilaterally shut down an international strait like that. Britain's Royal Navy said as much publicly. But when there's active fighting happening nearby, not legally binding and actually safe to sail through, are two very different sentences, and every shipping company on Earth understood the difference immediately. Tankers rerouted. Some simply sat in port and waited it out. Oil and gas prices moved within days. By mid-March, reporting out of the region described hundreds of ships stranded near the mouth of the strait, a significant number of them flying the Indian flag, none of them willing to gamble on whether Iran's warnings were bluff or actual policy. President Trump publicly called on other nations with a stake in that traffic, China, France, Japan, South Korea, and the United Kingdom, to send their own naval assets to help secure the waterway, while making clear that the United States would keep striking Iranian coastal targets and vessels regardless of who else showed up. By early April, that pressure had escalated into a direct ultimatum: reopen the strait by a specific deadline or face further destruction of Iranian infrastructure, with power plants and bridges named explicitly as targets. Iran refused to negotiate under that kind of threat. The deadline passed, the strikes continued. Then, on April 8th, the first real off-ramp in the entire conflict appeared. A ceasefire was reached between Washington and Tehran, reportedly including a commitment from Iran to fully reopen the strait to commercial shipping. The Secretary of War at the time expressed confidence the truce would hold, calling it a real window for diplomacy. For a few weeks, it actually looked like it might work. It didn't. By mid-April, Iran had resumed controlling traffic through the strait on its own terms, rather than reopening it the way the ceasefire had promised. On April 13th, the United States moved to impose a full naval blockade on Iranian ports, a quieter but far more direct form of pressure running in parallel with the standoff over the strait. Central Command reported intercepting dozens of vessels attempting to move in or out of Iranian ports over the following weeks. Within about a month, that intercepted total had climbed past 80 vessels by one count, though independent maritime tracking firms separately reported that dozens of ships had still managed to slip through the blockade line in both directions. On April 19th, U.S. Marines working alongside a guided missile destroyer carried out the blockade's first direct seizure, boarding and taking outright control of an Iranian-flagged vessel. This wasn't posturing anymore. This was an active naval interdiction campaign with real ships, real Marines, and real consequences for anyone caught in the middle. And this is the environment that Iran's fast boat fleet became relevant in again. By early May, with the blockade biting hard and the April ceasefire effectively dead in practice, even though nobody had officially declared it over, Iran started pushing its small boat fleet back into the strait in force. Mines became part of that pressure campaign too, not just boats and missiles. In late April, Trump posted publicly that the Navy was actively running mine countermeasure operations in the strait, and he separately ordered American forces to shoot and kill any vessel caught laying sea mines, adding that there would be no hesitation whatsoever. Multiple dedicated mine countermeasure ships based in Bahrain were tied directly to that mission. On May 3rd, Trump announced that the U.S. military would begin actively helping free up ship traffic through Hormuz, starting the very next morning. That operation got a name, Project Freedom. It launched on May 4th. According to Central Command's own statements, Iran responded to the American escort effort by launching cruise missiles, drones, and small attack boats at commercial ships, and in some cases directly at U.S. Navy vessels. The admiral overseeing the theater told reporters that American forces intercepted the incoming cruise missiles and drones, and that Apache and Seahawk helicopters sank 6 small Iranian boats in a single morning engagement. Separate tracking of Project Freedom's opening days put the total number of Iranian boats sunk during that specific operation at 7, alongside a strike on a French-flagged commercial vessel. The admiral's language on the record was blunt. He said he would strongly advise Iran to stay away from U.S. military assets, and he described the Revolutionary Guard as working to terrorize and threaten commercial shipping, while American forces, in his framing, were restoring the flow of global commerce. Now, let's talk about what was actually sitting in that region by the time those 130 boats got spotted on satellite. By late April, the United States had 3 full aircraft carrier strike groups operating simultaneously in the Middle East, a scale of presence that hadn't happened since the Iraq invasion of 2003. The world's largest carrier was there. A second carrier was there, and a third had just arrived after sailing all the way around the Cape of Good Hope, specifically to avoid exposure to threats in the Red Sea. Central Command put the combined footprint of that deployment at 12 accompanying ships, more than 200 aircraft, and over 15,000 sailors and Marines. One of those strike groups alone included 3 guided missile destroyers and a fast combat support ship. The Secretary of War told reporters at the time that blockade enforcement was working, and that every ship the U.S. believed was Iranian-flagged or moving to and from Iranian ports had been turned around. So when Iran's fast boat fleet massed in the strait in early May, it wasn't surging against a handful of patrol ships. It was surging into a waterway where 3 American carrier strike groups, backed by attack helicopters, guided missile destroyers, and armed drones, were already sitting, already positioned, and already operating under a presidential order to shoot and kill any vessel caught laying mines. No hesitation. That's the actual scale of firepower sitting behind the moment those Apache and Seahawk helicopters sank 6 Iranian boats in a single morning. It wasn't an improvised reaction to a surprise. It was one small piece of a historically massive military presence doing exactly the job it had been forward deployed to do. By the time the broader campaign got tallied up, U.S. forces had reportedly conducted more than 13,000 strikes against Iranian targets since the war began, and had damaged or destroyed more than 155 Iranian vessels of all types. That number is exactly why Iran needed a fleet running into the hundreds, and by some of its own estimates, over 1,000 boats, just to keep enough in reserve to mass again in May. That's the real origin of the moment that probably brought you to this story in the first place. 130 Iranian fast attack boats, confirmed by satellite, sitting in 2 formations inside the strait at the exact moment the United States had just launched a dedicated operation to protect shipping through that exact stretch of water. This wasn't a hypothetical standoff on paper. It was boats on one side, helicopters and warships on the other, inside a channel 21 miles wide at its narrowest, with the global oil market watching every single move in real time. And then, on May 6th, Trump paused Project Freedom, citing what he called great progress toward a possible complete and final agreement with Iran. The operation was temporarily halted while that diplomatic track got tested. I want to be precise here because it matters. A pause is not an end. The blockade stayed in place. The underlying dispute over the strait stayed in place. The military posture on both sides stayed exactly where it was. What changed was the tempo, not the standoff itself. Now here's where the story gets genuinely contested, and I think it's more honest to say that plainly than to smooth it over the way a lot of coverage does. Iranian state media, specifically the outlet Press TV, published pieces in the following weeks framing the outcome in a completely different light than U.S. officials did. Press TV described Iran's speedboat fleet as having turned the Strait of Hormuz into what it called a no-go zone for American naval forces, and characterized U.S. claims about degrading Iran's navy as hollow rhetoric that the facts on the water disproved. Iranian sources also claimed the Revolutionary Guard could field anywhere from hundreds to over 1,000 small attack boats, dispersed across hardened mountain bunkers and remote island sites, specifically so that no single strike could wipe the fleet out in one blow. I want to be really clear about something. Those are Iranian state media claims. They're not verified by Central Command, not by international wire services, not by any independent Western outlet. They should be treated as one government's version of events, produced by a state-controlled broadcaster with an obvious interest in projecting strength no matter what actually happened on the water. And to be fair, in the other direction, U.S. officials also made claims that went further than what's been independently verified. At various points, President Trump said Iran's navy had been essentially wiped out, with some of his statements describing Iranian submarines as destroyed and the rest of the fleet soon to follow. Iranian outlets rejected that completely. The honest version of the truth almost certainly sits somewhere between two governments, each telling the story in the way that serves them best. What we can say with more confidence, because it's backed by independent reporting from multiple outlets, is that the fighting didn't stay paused for long. On July 7th, the United States launched what it described as powerful retaliatory strikes on Iran, after Iranian forces attacked 3 commercial vessels transiting the strait: a Marshall Islands flagged tanker, a Saudi flagged vessel, and a Liberian flagged ship. That same week, Iranian state television broadcast footage of hundreds of thousands of mourners marching toward a mosque for a funeral procession honoring the slain supreme leader, with some marchers photographed calling for revenge and chanting against both the American president and the Israeli prime minister. At a NATO summit that same week, Trump described the conflict in strikingly bureaucratic terms, calling it not really a war at all, but what he termed a denuclearization operation targeting Iran. The escalation that followed July 7th was serious. U.S. forces launched additional strikes over the following days, hitting what officials described as dozens of targets across multiple locations using precision munitions aimed at degrading Iran's ability to keep attacking international shipping. Central Command's public statement specified that the targets included Iranian air defense systems, coastal radar sites, missile and drone capabilities, and, this is the part that matters for our story, more than 60 Revolutionary Guard small boats struck in and near the strait using fighter aircraft, naval vessels, and, for the first time in this entire conflict, one-way attack sea drones. That's a scale of small boat targeting well beyond the 6 or 7 sunk back in early May, and it shows just how central this Mosquito fleet doctrine had become to the entire campaign by midsummer. The international response to all of this became its own subplot, because this was never purely a two-country fight between Washington and Tehran. Early in the conflict, the United Arab Emirates publicly declared its willingness to join a U.S.-led military effort to help secure the strait. A meaningful signal given how exposed the UAE's own waters and shipping lanes are to anything that happens in the Gulf. Iran, for its part, didn't wait around for outside mediation. It stood up what it called the Persian Gulf Strait Authority, an Iranian body asserting the right to regulate and, at times, fully close transit through the strait on its own terms, completely separate from any international maritime framework. That authority is the one that later declared, in the aftermath of the July strikes, that the strait would remain closed until further notice, even as Central Command insisted commercial traffic was still moving. NATO's involvement stayed largely diplomatic rather than military, with alliance leadership indicating they were preparing for a possible support role without committing forces directly into the fighting. And there was a genuinely telling exchange captured in coverage from late April. After Iran briefly declared the strait fully open when a regional ceasefire extension touched Lebanon, then reblocked it in response to the U.S. port blockade, Trump posted publicly that he had, in his words, all the time in the world, but that Iran didn't, arguing the standoff was draining Iran's economy at almost no cost to the United States. When asked directly how long he'd wait for Iran to come back with a deal, his answer was 2 words: "Don't rush me." Iran, meanwhile, characterized the U.S. blockade as an outright act of war, and Iranian forces responded in kind by seizing foreign commercial ships transiting the strait, accusing them of violating what Tehran considered its own maritime regulations, essentially a mirror image of the interdiction tactics the U.S. was using against Iranian-flagged vessels. Iran didn't absorb the July strikes quietly either. The Revolutionary Guard announced retaliatory strikes on U.S.-linked facilities in Jordan, Kuwait, and Bahrain. Around the same period, Trump stated that Iran had shot down a U.S. Apache helicopter patrolling over the strait, and American forces reportedly conducted self-defense strikes on an Iranian military ground control station in response. Iran then launched missiles and drones toward Kuwait and Bahrain, though tracking of the conflict indicated all of them failed to hit their intended targets. Here's the freshest part of the story, and I think it matters most for anyone watching this expecting a clean, wrapped-up ending, because there isn't one yet. As of this week, the diplomatic and military picture remains genuinely unsettled. Trump announced he was canceling a planned new wave of strikes on Iran, saying that Iranian officials and other Middle Eastern governments had asked him to hold off, with reporting indicating he'd specifically discussed the situation with the Saudi crown prince, who raised concerns about the risk of the conflict spreading further. A military analyst noted publicly that both Riyadh and Tehran have strong incentives to keep this from spreading, given how economically exposed Saudi Arabia is to a continued closure of the strait. Trump, in his own remarks, said the U.S. remained, in his words, locked and loaded and ready to go against Iran, but that he'd agreed to hold off because a framework of a deal had reportedly been agreed to, one that would include the immediate reopening of the strait and what he called an end to Iran's nuclear threat. That optimism didn't survive 24 hours. Within a day, Trump was publicly calling Iranian leadership unbelievably duplicitous, after Tehran denied that direct talks with Washington had actually resumed, even as Iranian officials confirmed separately that they were talking with Oman about establishing a new route through the strait. Trump has continued to talk about a so-called Phase 1 agreement, focused narrowly on reopening the strait that could be reached quickly, with a more complex Phase 2 centered on denuclearization following on a longer timeline. Both of those phases reportedly trace back to a memorandum of understanding that Iran and the U.S. signed back in June. Whether that memorandum survives the current back and forth of accusations is right now an open question that nobody has definitively answered. It's worth pausing on how large the economic shockwave from all of this actually was, because the strait's importance isn't an abstract talking point. It's measurable in dollars, at gas stations, and on shipping invoices everywhere. Before this war started, roughly a quarter of the world's seaborne oil trade and about a fifth of global liquefied natural gas moved through the Strait of Hormuz. When Iran began restricting, and at times effectively closing, the strait starting in late February, oil and gas prices moved almost immediately on global markets. OPEC Plus countries held an emergency virtual meeting in early April and agreed to raise production quotas by roughly 200,000 barrels a day starting in May, a move explicitly aimed at cushioning global markets against the volatility coming out of the conflict. By July, the ripple effects had spread well beyond the Gulf itself, with maritime data tracking noting that disruptions tied to the crisis were pushing some Asian oil buyers toward alternative routes and choke points entirely, showing how a closure in one narrow waterway can cascade into pressure on shipping lanes thousands of miles away. Shipping insurers felt this crisis just as sharply as oil traders did. War risk premiums for vessels transiting the strait climbed sharply within days of the first closures, and some underwriters reportedly stopped offering coverage for that route entirely for stretches of the conflict, which is effectively the same thing as closing the strait, even if no government ever issued that order. For a shipping company, an uninsurable route and a physically blocked route cost almost the same amount of money, and that's part of why so many operators chose to sit in port rather than gamble on a single transit. The human logistics side of this was just as real as the financial side. Mid-March reporting described hundreds of ships, a significant share of them Indian-flagged, sitting stranded near the strait rather than risk transiting it, even after Iran's foreign minister told American media that the waterway wasn't technically closed to everyone, just to vessels linked to the United States and Israel. That distinction, a technically open strait that shipping companies were still too afraid to use, sums up how this entire crisis functioned for global commerce. Rarely a hard, total blockade, but a persistent, expensive climate of risk that made insurers, ship owners, and entire national economies change their behavior regardless of what the formal rules on paper actually said. And it's worth putting a human cost on this too, because a story about boats and satellites can start to feel abstract if you only talk about it in terms of hardware and headlines. Tracking of the broader crisis puts the documented toll, as of the most recent compiled figures, at one tugboat sunk, at least 17 merchant ships damaged, roughly 7 of those reportedly abandoned by their crews, 2 merchant ships captured outright, 12 seafarers killed or missing, and 1 port worker killed with 2 more wounded in a separate incident. Those aren't abstractions. Those are ordinary sailors doing ordinary cargo runs who got caught in a choke point that turned into a war zone almost overnight. So where does all of that leave the specific moment that gave this story its title? The sighting of roughly 130 Iranian fast boats and the US military response that followed, it sits inside a 5-month arc that began with the killing of Iran's supreme leader, ran through a ceasefire that collapsed within weeks, a naval blockade, a named military operation that sank Iranian boats by the handful in early May, an escalation in July that saw the US strike more than 60 small boats in a single wave, and a diplomatic process in early August that appears to be simultaneously close to a partial deal and one social media post away from falling apart completely. Those 130 boats weren't some isolated provocation that came out of nowhere. They were Iran demonstrating in the most visible way possible, visible enough for a commercial satellite to catch it in broad daylight, that despite months of American strikes, despite the blockade, despite repeated public claims of having crippled Iran's naval power, the fast boat fleet at the core of its entire strategy in that strait was still there, still numerous, still capable of massing on short notice whenever Tehran decided it needed to send a message. Whether that message actually changes anything, whether the strait fully reopens under whatever framework gets negotiated next, or whether this becomes just one more pause before the next round of strikes is genuinely still an open question. Nobody watching this conflict closely on either side of it is claiming to know the ending yet. So I want to ask you directly, do you think the strait actually reopens for good under this so-called Phase 1 framework? Or is this just the calm before round 2? Put your prediction in the comments. I read every single one. And if you want me tracking this the moment anything new breaks, make sure you're subscribed, because this story is nowhere close to finished.